Anyway, so this is supposed to be about scaling Agile or about Scrum of Scrums. And I believe we have some opening questions. So basically, the first question would be, why do you actually would want to scale Agile? What would be the circumstances that you would actually consider scaling? Because I have done it a couple of times, and each time it was very hard to do the scaling. And I was always thinking about, do we really need to scale? So what would you think are the key decision makers that you really need to scale it?
Do you want to give the word to someone, or?
I think that whoever wants to answer, go for it.
Well, for me, the trigger is just the word scale, because it's an easy word to throw out there when we go beyond one team. So what is behind the feeling that we need to consciously do something to scale versus downplaying maybe that? Because when people hear that word, they immediately hear safe, or they immediately hear some big scaling framework or governance or process or whatever that is. And are we just talking about 3 teams here? Then get them all in a room and have them talk to each other. So how complex do we need to make this approach versus how much extra overhead do we add and pile on to the existing teams?
Yeah, from my perspective, for the benefit of the audience, my name is George. I'm an independent Agile coach. I work in London. At the moment, I'm contracting with the Ministry of Justice. I've been actually brought in to support their scaling ambitions. And one of the questions that we wanted to answer in the beginning was, well, what are we actually scaling? So I think for an organization that starts with one product, it is quite a natural experience that hopefully the product is doing well. The demand for the product is growing, and at some point it will become too much for one team to handle to introduce new features or improve the product. So that is a quite natural drive for an organization to start adding another team and then start coordinating them. For large and older organizations, it's still about product demand, in my point of view, although the demand consideration is a bit more intricate to answer. It's not solely about what the user wants, it's also about the business objectives, and there might be some technology objectives as well. But it's always in answer to product demand, rather than just saying, we have tons of people, let's introduce a framework.
Yeah, which has been a problem that I faced. That previously I was working at a large bank here in Czech Republic, and then they heard the buzzword Agile, right? They knew nothing about it, so we need to be Agile, and we need to scale. And Jason, just as you said, the first was safe. We need to do safe because it's the top Agile scaling framework, right? But we were talking about 5 teams at the start. And I was like, why would we introduce such a complex process for 5 teams? Let's get them in one open space. Let's give them one backlog, somebody capable of making the business decisions, and just try it. And then there was another problem, which for me is a sort of key. At that time, we couldn't do Scrum in one team, and they wanted to go from none to 5. Which proved to be a bad decision.
Yeah, my only experience with SAFE, right now I'm currently at a great company, study.com, where I'm a Scrum Master for 2 teams. We have 10 total right now, 5 on the development side, 5 on the content side. And so right now we're pretty interested in figuring out, should we scale? What are the benefits? What problems are we trying to solve in the first place? The company I came from, which just not going to mention the name right now. It was they were trying to run SAFE with about 13 Scrum teams. None of the teams were doing Scrum correctly. They took a lot of technical PMs and said, "You're all Scrum Masters." And from that point, you had a lot of managerial overriding of any kind of agreed upon Agile processes be instituted. For example, a contractor who was on a Scrum team could not talk to the PO without an employee escorting them to the PO, and all this type of stuff. So I'm here to really just try to learn everybody's experience, the benefits of scaling in general, because my own experience with it, especially with Safe, I don't think it was done correctly, and I saw no benefit.
Some of the things I've seen, well, not this client, but the previous one I worked at, was the barrier for them to try a Scrum of Scrums or move towards multi-team Agile, because they didn't really know what they wanted. They just knew that they wanted to do this stuff, was budgeting. So in order for Team A to go to Team B's stand-up, they said, we're charging your project code $25,000. And Team B said, I won't say the word, politely declined. So they just chose to not communicate. So they just chose to blow the integration up at the end because budgeting got in the way. Like, we need that 25 grand for features. So I have to charge my time against some code. So for me, I don't think it's not necessarily a case of not doing Scrum or the framework right. It's it's not understanding where the teams or the multiple set of teams or the program teams are intersecting with the rest of the organization.
Yeah.
And they see a way to make it about compliance and governance. And like one of the teams I'm working with here, there's 14 teams working in a portfolio, and the official process method is Scrum. So they're having all this Scrum type of stuff inflicted on them. And they're like, well, dude, we get interrupted 3 or 4 times a day because of the nature of our work. So I think that they pushed to create the illusion of certainty versus trying to understand how do we standardize our process, because we don't have stable teams, which leads to the desire to standardize it, because now if I'm a PM on project 1 and I move to project 2, if that team does something differently, I'm lost. So we have to standardize it. So I think they missed most of the teams I work with missed the step of understanding the type of work that they do and how they intersect with the rest of the organization, and then basically have conversations to figure out how does that intersection happen and what do we need to do. So take all the Agile scaling framework, Scrum, all this crap, take that out of the discussion and just say, where does your work come from? Who gets it when you're done with it? What restrictions do you have? Like I'm working with a large bank now, and good God, the amount of paperwork these teams have to deal with is mind-blowing. So we just chip away. Well, why do you create this? Who is it for? What do they need it for? And in all cases, it comes down to, back in 1981, something blew up in production. So Biff, the VP, created a policy that here 30 years later is just the way things work. But that kind of crap happens every day. So now we have 300 things that each team has to deal with. And there's no process or method or framework that's going to fix that problem. So how do we make it easier or more simple for these teams to coordinate their work?
Yeah, I think we've already hit on quite a few of the common points. Firstly, that it needs to work well in one team before we want to introduce any type of scale. But more importantly, that we need to look at the organization and improve upon dysfunctions that are existing there. Because the government here, as you can imagine, is a very old organization, and they have built processes and added to that over time, never questioned. The validity of them is still there. So, for example, one of the teams, in order to ultimately remove one of the old systems, they are accessing the data layer of that. And for that, they need to integrate an API. So in order to build that, they would have to subscribe to a 6-week release cycle with a release document that is 15 pages long. This makes absolutely no sense. So one of the first things that they did was to question all of that. And they've brought it down after a few discussions only to 1 week and to a brief message that just contains the updates. And that's only the first step of the journey, right? Over time, they might be able to get to a point where they can really achieve true continuous integration. But that's an example of the way that we are working, exposing this function in the organization that needs to be addressed so that the team can deliver value quickly without inhibition from the organization, from the old part of the organization that we're transforming.
Yeah, that kind of makes a lot of sense, but I have been in the same situation Jason has been. I also worked for a large bank here in the Czech Republic, And the problem was that when the decision to scale was made, the problem wasn't actually that the product couldn't be taken care of by one team. The problem was that there was so much bureaucracy, so much processes, and so much added work that the need to scale came just from the demand to do more and more bureaucracy. Whereas the correct solution would be to cut down the bureaucracy and have one team to actually deliver some value within the product. Not have 3 teams dealing with bureaucracy and, yeah, as you said, filling release notes that are 20 pages long and nobody reads them, right? Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, the hard part I've seen is, that bureaucracy is in place. From our perspective as coaches or outside consultants, it's a waste. But if you consider, well, how do we solve that problem? Do we lay off 300 people? Do we get rid of a whole stack of hierarchy in our organization? Like I find the Agile community, we don't talk about what are these real problems that these organizations have. And if we want that bureaucracy to go away, we don't need these 400 people. What are you going to do with them? Whose decision is it to let go of that whole arm of the organization, or retrain them, or take the cost to move them to another department? These are real organizational design problems. But from our perspective, it's just, well, it's waste. We have to stop doing it. And most, if not all, my work is in 40,000 plus organizations. It's a whole different, like, there's somebody here who's responsible for printing out the headings of Kanban boards, for crying out loud. I got introduced to them and I'm like, I can print, dude. Like, there's so much emphasis on specialization. When we want to get rid of that, we got to get rid of people, and nobody wants to have that conversation.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely true. The bank I was mentioning here in Prague is actually owned by a French, it's Société Générale. It's a French company. And there is no way that you can actually lay off somebody. Yeah. So what it ends up, it ends up that you make work for the people because you have them there. So you make work for them, right? And you don't have infinite amount of products because you don't have infinite amount of clients. So you make a paperwork because it's easy, and then you make the hierarchy so that you can advance the people through the hierarchy to the top, right? Because people like that, or they don't. But the old manager thinks that people like that. Yeah, but I agree with Jason that these are really the core questions. Because scaling Agile, if you have good teams and the teams know how to work, and if you have the environment, it's easy. Yeah, you have a big product, you have one backlog, you give it to them, and they work, and it's nice. Usually works. But the problem is when the organization is different.
Have y'all seen any of the scaling frameworks, or have you guys seen scaling in general answer any of these questions?
Not for me. The most. If any, large-scale Scrum is the one that addresses it head-on, because it says you scale by descaling, which means you basically have to gut the middle of your organization and remove your managers, emphasis on over-specialization. I saw Craig talk about this in Chicago, and he was very blunt that this is not something that some of the other scaling frameworks that are more process-oriented try and find a home for everybody in this new model. So if I was a product manager, I'm now a product owner. If I was the senior QA of toilet paper, I'm now whatever this new role type of thing is. And from Craig's perspective, that's why we have the problem in the first place. So all that has to go, which implies you've got to, get rid of or demote a bunch of people.
Yeah, same here. Large-scale Scrum, the LESS framework is the only one that, when scaling, is really making sense. That I suggest to look at as a starting point. And LESS is very open, as Jason said, about the fact that what we're dealing with is 70% organizational change and 30% scaling process and coordination amongst teams. But for those who are less familiar with large-scale Scrum, with LESS, it's based on the 2 books that Craig wrote together with Paz. And the larger of the 2 is all about theory related to organizational design and organizational change. And the shorter one is about practical things that you can try or that you should avoid. Just because all of the organizational aspects are so much more important. And in what we're, it comes back to transforming the organization. And back to the example that you mentioned, Tomasz, in this bank, especially in France, where labor laws are very protective of the employees. It would be tempting to just create work for those people. But if we're true change agents, then we must fight that that desire to create work, because they're not creating value, right? We're about creating value. We're about turning a waste machine into a value machine. Yeah. But then, yeah. So what? So we have 300 people who don't do anything. Maybe that is reason enough for them to change something about the way that the organization works with unions or whatever the protection is.
Gotcha. Do y'all know how long we've time boxed this conversation for?
Well, the entire conversation should be 15 minutes from the invitation. So we have 28 minutes left. 27. Okay.
All right, fantastic.
Frameworks we had, we've also got SAFe out there somewhere. I personally am not a big fan of SAFe. I went on the course. I talked to a lot of people who are in organizations that use it. And as Jason said, it is, so I like to look at it as a paint job, right? You use the organization as it stands today. It's a paint job. As Jason said, everyone gets different titles for pretty much everything that you have in a traditional IT and project management Prince 2 organization. You have a different name, and you have a slightly different way of them doing what they've always done. And all of a sudden, the organization said, yeah, we're Agile, and we're practicing it at scale. I think it's okay as a starting point, as long as you then dip into principles from the large-scale Scrum framework, which are all about continuous improvement and having those difficult conversations. But if an organization implements SAFe and thinks they're Agile and they stick with that for years, then by definition, they're not changing anything, they're not improving anything. That's not Agile.
Yeah, my experience with SAFe is, again, that it just allows for that management override of the Agile processes. And yeah, I saw that really get in the way of any kind of productivity. Saw teams starting to have secret product backlogs that they can actually get some work done, all this kind of stuff. Yeah.
The problem with SAFe, or at least as I see it, is that it's very nicely presented, yeah, and there's got this very nice structure. So the managers, traditional managers, they like it because they still see the control in the framework, which apparently you don't see it in less, because less is about actually descaling the organization, making it simpler. SAFe, no. SAFe is about keeping the hierarchy and just somehow make it work.
I think that the one thing that's missing, but also that's missing from large-scale Scrum, but that it also doesn't assume to offer, is portfolio management. And especially for an old organization that is still early in going through digital transformation, where they need to assess, well, what are the services that we're actually offering? What are the products that we're offering as part of that end-to-end series of customer problems? And therefore, above the level of one product group that we can support using a less framework, what does the world look like there? And less in itself doesn't really answer that question very well. So that's why traditional management, I think, is more drawn to SAFe. But again, for us as change agents, that's where we need to provide the education, help them see what their options are. And just looking at less to answer all questions, again, in itself wouldn't be a suitable response. Any one framework is never the answer. Right?
Yeah. If I may, go into my organization here, again, we have the 10 teams. And right now we're actually trying to restructure where we have 5 Scrum Masters, 2 teams each. Right now, the ones of us who are more tech savvy are overseeing the dev teams. We're trying to break that up to get it to be one tech team, one content team, to kind of bind the organization and keep it from splitting off into 2. Another thing we're doing is we have, I would say, a basic Scrum of Scrums set up to where right now it's really being facilitated by one Scrum Master, and the product owners are getting in there to kind of share what's going on. I'm not sure that that's kind of the maybe the most optimal approach, or that we're extracting the right amount of value out of it that we can. So what have y'all's experience been with as far as establishing those Scrums, or, you know, pulling more value out of them that they're currently getting?
For me, the first thing is getting rid of that perceived invisible barrier. So some of the organizations I've worked in, again, more larger organizations, is I worked in one place where there were two teams on the same floor on opposite sides of the floor working in the same program, never talked to each other. The way that we started a Scrum of Scrums was I knew the coach who was working with the other team, and I just said to my team, I said, oh, I know somebody who started over there, and they put their work up on a task board. Do you want to go over and see it? That was it. And then the Scrum Master, I went over with him to look at that wall, and he looked at it and went, well, why are they working on this? I'm like, I don't know. They is right here. They're sitting beside us. Let's talk to them. So it was just, and it wasn't, you know, you hear those stories and you hear, well, what a bunch of idiots, but it's real for people, right? I've been in organizations where, as a coach, I've actually, if I've gone to help a team that's asked me for help, but I'm not officially assigned to them, within 30 minutes, I got a phone call from a director. You're not authorized and allowed to blah, blah, blah. And I think that happens so many times with teams that they just forget that they can just go over and have a conversation. And sometimes they just need an external poke to make that happen. And then these guys, they officially started a Scrum of Scrums, but I've had other teams where it's just the two Scrum Masters go for coffee a couple of times a week. So we really just want the communication happening between them. So I like to ask them questions around, well, how did you coordinate work in the pre-Agile world, if you will? And they said, well, every week we had a meeting where we had the tech lead and the Scrum Masters get in a room and figure out blah, blah, blah. And I said, great. How effective was that? Oh, it worked well. Cool. Keep doing it. So, you know, get to the practice that works versus how do we implement this additional practice?
Yeah, I think communication is key. So enforcing a structure that is of no benefit to participants is, again, a practice that will not really take off or take hold. But if the nature of the work of two or more teams is somehow related or aligned, then they need to be encouraged if they're not already wanting to talk to each other some way or another. And it could be as simple as somebody from one team joining a stand-up of another team. Yeah, and maybe for that person to take turns, and then they play back in their own stand-up. Just like this, you have a little bit of communication between the two teams. You have representation of the two teams in each other's daily communication. And that is another way of doing something that is before you would go to a Scrum of Scrums. But if all the teams are really working on something that is working on the same product, then you could do a Scrum of Scrums as a coordination mechanism, of course. The only thought that might be worth pointing out is that in that scenario, it shouldn't be the team coach or Scrum Master doing that, right? Because they are not the people doing work. So it should be somebody from the team representing their team in the Scrum of Scrums, and for again to rotate so that we're not always drawing the time of any one person.
Okay. So it sounds like also one of the things we want to watch out for is maybe even siloed work within the team itself. Like make sure the teams are collaborating before we start scaling up to have the other teams collaborating amongst each other.
Yeah, that would be a key point, because if you have no collaboration on the team level or between two separate teams, it wouldn't. Sorry, that was my son. It would be very hard to make Scrum of Scrums or any scaling work if there is no normal communication between people or between the teams. And like this you can do simple things to foster communication and collaboration between the teams. As you said, you can just ask them, well, join the stand-up of the other team. They are right there. Just go there. Because sometimes people just don't realize they can actually go somewhere and ask. They prefer to theorize or to make assumptions instead of going and asking. So that in my experience always helped. some stupid things also help. We had a problem that two teams weren't communicating with each other because they were in two different open spaces, and there was a door between them, and it was for the passkey. And every time you went, you had to go for the passkey, wait for 3 seconds, and then the door opened. And just by removing the door, communication improved dramatically.
Yeah, it's amazing. What physical barriers, and was it a glass door or was it a?
No, it was a solid door, so they cannot see through it. Yeah.
Yeah, it would have been even better story if it had been a glass door.
Yeah, it would be funny, right? Like watching behind the glass door. Oh, what are you doing there? that would be funny. Yeah. Anyway, we have a question from the real Jennifer, who is masked as Dargayan. If it doesn't mean that there is a risk of making things too complicated by scaling Scrum, so what do you think? Any ideas?
I think if we put the process or process, depending on which country you're listening to this in, putting that above what problem you're trying to solve, it can make it too complex. You know, if it's something, if you kind of buy into this experimentation mindset that something isn't working right here and we think we should try the Scrum of Scrums, let's just try it for a month and then talk about whether or not it worked. And then that might actually help you figure out, well, maybe it was a different problem that we were trying to solve. So I think if we in the pattern I see a lot is the Agile experts are brought in and they go in a room and create the perfect process and then try to unleash it on the rest of the organization versus trying to understand what problem it is that they're trying to solve. So I think it can get complex when the people who have to live with the consequence of that change aren't the people who are actually creating that experiment, because it doesn't mean anything to them. They might not even see there's a problem. Yeah, we have 3 teams here, but things seem to work fine. It's some manager has a perception that things aren't working well, so we need a scaling process. So always, for me, it's always has to be the people in the teams, a facilitated conversation between them, and then having them understand what's the perspective of managers, what's the perspective of the top leadership team, and where are we diverged on those perspectives. Start with a conversation. There might not be a problem at all.
Yep. Kind of in my experience, what I've always tried is to use the simpler thing that actually works and start from where you are. Just as Jason said, not trying to impose a new complex process on the teams, but look at how they are and what we actually need to achieve and start from there.
I know one of the fears that comes up is how to preserve a team's individuality as things start integrating more with other teams. So, you know, we have some teams that do the story point estimation with animals and others who do the Fibonacci sequence. And so then, you know, some people start throwing around, well, do we need to all have a standardized process for story pointing and that kind of stuff? And my just gut feeling is absolutely don't touch what works for the team.
What does that difference that the teams are using, does that cause any conflict or any raised eyebrows at the leadership level that it's not standardized?
For the fact of, you know, if they want to start pulling in certain metric data, say, you know, everybody here is using Jira. And so that particular team that's using animal sizes, it's not going to look the same as far as, you know, if they want to go and look at a burned down chart, those types of things, versus team B who's using the Fibonacci sequence. But what, you know, we were trying to solve a problem and it worked for that team. They really latched onto the animals is because they were having a hard time decoupling time from effort. And, you know, somebody a long time ago here put in their minds that one story point equals half a day of effort. And so those are the, you know, little things we're trying to overcome. It's like, no, this has been working well for us. So let's not touch it to try to standardize something.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I really like that. Yeah, same here. At the MOJ, every team, when they start and when they reset, they come up with their own stuff. And the only thing that we're looking at across the teams which work on multiple products, so at the moment there are 10 or 12 teams, is team health or team happiness. Yeah, and that's again assessed by the team. Yeah, and that's what we're looking at. So just so that we can track the impact of organizational improvements on the teams. So they do their own improvements, and then the team coaches work together on organizational improvements. If it's working, hopefully we will see an uplift in team happiness across the teams. But how they report their happiness is abstracted, because they all have their own scale and their own way of doing it in their own teams. Right?
So is there a way to scale the increases empowerment?
Involvement increases empowerment at scale. Yeah.
Yep.
For me, it still comes back to how does that team intersect with the rest of the organization? So if every team is using a different way that they approach sizing, and they're pretty much independent, who cares? But if there is a lot of interconnections between those teams, somebody who is more of a program manager is probably going to want a sense of when are certain things going to get done. Keep it as light as possible. I mean, one of the teams here, they're funded for $10.5 million a year, and their business stakeholder is understandably so asking, what am I getting for my $10.5 million? And the team's coming back with, well, we're Agile, it doesn't work that way. I'm like, well, yeah, if I was responsible for an almost $11 million budget, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect some type of roadmap or some way of knowing what these 14 teams are working on. And in other organizations, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe that's just a team that's funded the same amount every year, and they can hand that $10.5 million out every quarter. But really, for me, it's got to be what's the impact that decision the team is making on the rest of the organization, and how disruptive would it be, versus immediately jumping to, we got to put a process model in place, or the feeling that we have to standardize. I don't know how many times I hear, well, we're a big bank, we have to. And I'm like, bullshit, you do not. You've imposed this stuff on yourself for the most part. So how do we pick away at some of the internal governance and the internal push for standards? And usually it's because there's 35 VPs who all get a different report from 35 of their direct reports, who consolidate reports from, and it all comes down to one team having to produce 30 different reports with the same data, formatted differently. And that's the problem we need to solve, not so much the scaling. It's why do we need to do this?
Yeah, I think those conversations are actually very well supported, again, on the product portfolio level. And that also can act as a mechanism of shielding the teams from all of that. So rather than looking into the teams themselves and standardizing the process that they are using for work, working together with stakeholders in the organization to come up with a portfolio planning and management approach that works for them, where they can see what is the roadmap for product A, B, C, D, E, F, G, what are they getting for the money, how many teams are associated with that, ergo how much investments do they put into each of those teams, and then ensure that the product owners have regular dialogue with those stakeholders and feed in the product roadmap, because then the stakeholder landscape can get a very clear picture what is investment versus value over time, rather than entertaining conversations that dissect the process that goes into each team.
Okay, that makes sense. Oh, we have another question from the real Jennifer. And that is, if there are any picks, if there are any tips to pick away the bureaucratic standards we are talking about, because honestly, we are talking about scaling, but I think we are in agreement that scaling is not the real problem, right? Like, scaling is trivial. If the organization is good and scaling makes sense, to scale actually is the smallest problem. The real problem is with the organization usually, right? And the bureaucracy and the stuff like that. So do you have any tips how to deal with the bureaucracy?
I'm heavily biased towards visualizing work, even in distributed environments. So when I started with this client, the first conversation I had with the VP is, all the work is going up on the walls, and you need to be seen walking around asking people people about this work. And he's based in 6 time zones away, so he's here in the office for a week a month, pretty much. Once people see you're asking about work and asking about what risks are happening, everybody will fall in line. So can you get support from the highest stakeholder to actually walk the walk? And if you don't, I still do it anyway. I visualize the work and say, oh, come here, let me show you something that this team is working on here. Linking teams to other teams is a practice I use all the time. So if I get wind of another team here that's doing something cool, I'll bring a bunch of people around and I'll say, hey, you know what? This team solved whatever this problem was with this status report or whatever. Let's go talk to them and see how they do it. So I focus more on community building. I don't really care what process framework they use or method or agile mindset or not. For me, it's always focusing on being a bridge and connecting people, because I'm always the outside consultant. So yeah, I don't have a stake in the outcome, but.
And what that all of that behavior does is over time increase the trust between. So again, I'm thinking in the context of there are several teams that are using Agile product development to create some useful products that add value, but then there is the rest of the organization that is rubbing up against it because they have all of those old processes and those old bureaucracies in place, and their way of working has been so fundamentally different for such a long time that it is incomprehensible just to look at the way that we're working. So in order to bridge the gap over time, we need to build trust, and we need to help them understand that it's not us versus them, that it is an us together, over time actually bridging that gap. And it can only come by visualizing the work and helping them understand the way that we're working, that we're not cowboys that are completely throwing out the window risk management and governance, but that our approach is quite different to it. And because we are doing it the way that we're doing it, actually, ultimately, we will have a higher chance of a better outcome. But it requires ongoing communication as well with the bureaucratic layers of the organization. So that they don't feel threatened by the way that we're doing things, but rather understand the value of it, doing it.
Intentional disruption and well-timed interventions always seem to work. I had one today, actually, where I'm starting an internal coaching development program. So the division I'm working with is 1,600 people, so it's not all that big, but we need about probably 14 to 16 coaches and a good 160 to 200 people who are going to be the Agile champions to keep this thing moving along. And the approach for this is to do it in an organic way. Like this organization, they've got their official learning and development group and all this other type of stuff. So I just asked, I hope none of them are watching this. I asked the VP, I said, well, I know this dude in learning and development, and some organizations get pissed if you kind of do learning stuff without involving them. Should I cause this problem, or should I go through them? And he's like, yeah, don't worry about it for now, because he's taking the experimentation approach. Is how do we get the people with the right attitude to become coaches, and then help us at least figure out what it is that we want to try and do. So chipping away at that bureaucracy is more or less trying to understand what level of disruption this organization can tolerate, and how do you get on the edge of that so you are raising eyebrows and you're causing a storm of emails at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night without going too far rogue. And that line is the hard thing to balance. But that, for me, that's the best way to chip away at those bureaucratic things, because it's easy for me as an outsider to see the impact of that stuff. But the people in the system, it's just the way things are. So they don't even know how to challenge it. It's not that they're stupid or they don't want to. It's been the norm for so long that it's kind of easy to pick apart from the outside.
Yeah, and from the inside, they're so used to it, right, that they are not questioning it, and they're not encouraged to either. The continuous improvement spirit is something that we are introducing that's just not there. So making work visible, very important, as Jason said, using that and continuous delivery of value and demonstrating that and inviting the stakeholders to see that on a regular basis, to over time show them, yeah, we are reliable, we are delivering value every 1, 2, 3, however many weeks, hopefully not more than 4, and using that alongside a concerted effort or in collaboration with learning and development, because a lot of the people in the traditional parts of the organization, they need to learn new things, right? So they you can set up a program with Learning and Development Center to put them through training. And then you have a coaching program that goes along that to help them not forget what they learn in training, but rather be encouraged continuously to see where they can apply that. And with that, I like the way that they put it, Jason. What was it? What kind of disruption was it?
Oh, intentional disruption?
Yeah, I feel like it's missing a little bit of a qualifier, because yes, it is definitely intentional, and yes, it is disruptive, but we also touched on the fact that it shouldn't be too much too soon.
Yeah.
Right. So there's this. It's like meet them half a step ahead. Yeah.
Figure out what the level of tolerance is for disruption, yes. And then take one extra step beyond that. Yeah.
That I would say is very important, because I have been doing this as well, but it's really very important that you do not cross the line, because then things can go horribly wrong.
Yeah.
And especially in the bank I was at, the tolerance level was tiny. So I really had to go one small step at a time. For example, just pick one stupid report or one stupid something and say, why is this needed? And they were like, oh, because it's, we don't know. So, and I was like, so why are you filling it? Well, because it's this process. And I was like, no, that's not the answer. Why are you doing it? What purpose does it have? And by these small steps, I was able to cut a tiny bit of the bureaucracy. A whole lot remains there, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, well, I have a question. So we've had a couple of recent changes within our management, and I've noticed that's kind of also making the lives of the product owners a little painful, to where I'm having the product owners, my one-on-one, saying Scrum is taking up too much of my time. I am not able to sit with my team. And I'm like, well, let's go through the Scrum framework real quick. There's these mandatory checkpoints, and if you notice, you're with your team during the checkpoints. And so where is your other time being spent? Because I've observed it, they're not able to be at the desk or even able to take lunch. And so it's all these additional stakeholder meetings that are being requested of them and pull in there. And so as we look at trying to improve that and scaling, what would y'all's advice be on something like that? Because I'm starting to see some things pop up, such as product refinement meetings, where we go ahead and look at that roadmap. And so it's not like there's not value in some of them, but I think that they're having too frequent, too long, that kind of stuff.
I've usually seen that where if teams don't get really good at sprint planning and backlog grooming, for example, the stuff that comes out of those two meetings tends to bleed into other things.
Yeah.
So your stand-up ends up being a design meeting, and you have to have that extra Friday road mapping sessions and things like that, because I've had some teams where we're talking about a story and they want to get more information about it, so they create a meeting to talk about that story afterwards. But I'm like, that's why we're here in the sprint planning. So I had a smaller organization that had the same problem, and it turns out that their sprint planning actually took about 2 days, because they did it in batches. They did like 2 hours here and then an hour there, because people were split between multiple projects and things like that. And they wanted to figure out that exact problem. Like, why don't we have any time to get anything done? So we just dug into how sprint planning happens, and their experiment was, we're going to bite the bullet and sit in a room for a whole day and figure this out, and then do a retrospective on it.
I think that from hearing that also, I think a couple other things could happen. Well, if we visualize our work, maybe some of that would go away, because the stakeholders can be swinging by more frequently and having those conversations a little bit more natural in the team area. The other thing, too, as you're talking about with sprint planning, one thing, as I'm really new to this organization, but coming in here, I'm trying to slowly nudge that of getting them to actually use more time that is kind of recommended for those. We run 2-week sprints. We have 45-minute essentially intervals for those ceremonies, which is way too short for a planning session.
Yeah. That's challenging, 45 minutes.
And since it is a very new organization, very, very young developers who are super dedicated, their backlogs, it's like we're going to have to play the long game. Everything is drilled down one step. So an epic is probably the size of a story, task, that kind of thing. I'm thinking if we solve those and visualize the work, maybe then we can see these meetings naturally just die off. Looks like we have another set of questions.
Yes, we have another question about the line between where it actually works and where it fails. How do we actually find it? For me, it was always trial and error.
I've never been the most subtle guy, and so I've always found it pretty quick by being told, whoa, too far.
Yeah. And
actually, I think that if you are being told it's too far, actually, it's just the correct amount.
Yeah.
Of course, the real answer to this is very context specific, right? It's hard to say exactly, we probe, right? We probe, and once we find we're getting a little bit of resistance, we probe a bit more, and once we get resistance to the point where it's being blocked off, that's too far.
Yeah. One tip is to ask for permission to cross that line. So this VP, when I started, I said, I'm going to be, if you imagine this little circle is the normal way things work around here, I'm going to live like out here. And it's going to annoy people, but I wouldn't be doing my job effectively if I wasn't picking away at these problems. Sometimes it'll be abrasive, but my intent is to try and help you guys figure out where it is you actually want to go. Just be aware that, if I'm running amok, some stuff is going to make some people outside this group angry, and they're going to come over to you and say, leash your dog or whatever it is. But getting permission, I think, to cross those boundaries, as long as it's done in a respectful way, I think, but that implies you have a direct ear to the highest leader in the organization, which fortunately I do this time around.
Yeah.
Okay. And for those of us who may be also brand new in the organization or trying to establish that, what would your recommendation be to building that direct line or political cloud?
Oh, it's almost easier when you're new because you get to use that excuse. It's like, I didn't know. I just wanted to find out who this was, so I asked somebody, and they said, talk to Biff, the VP of blah. So I called him up. And then you learn very quickly. One public sector organization, I learned that wasn't received very well. The way that your line to the top leaders was to speak loudly near their admins. Because the admins of the executive assistants were the people that had all the power in this organization. So you needed to plant rumors into that community, and then they took it where it needed to go. And if you, that's not written in a process document anyway. But when you're new, you've got a great opportunity to find those people and establish credibility really, really quickly, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
Excellent.
Okay.
Good.
There are no other questions, and we've been here for an hour now, almost.
We have some of the original questions, but we are at the top of the hour. This is a very wonderful conversation, a very interesting subject. So I'd be happy to continue a little bit more if.
Sure. Yeah. Let's continue.
I'm going to have to jump off because I have to go to one of those meetings I would like to see over with.
Okay.
It's been excellent talking to you guys. Thank you very much.
Josh, before you go, one thing that I suggest, maybe you're doing this already, at the end of a session where you're thinking, something was particularly good and something was particularly worth improving, to encourage the team to do a micro retro on this particular session.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good.
A bit. Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Shorten the feedback.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Cheers, Josh.
All right, bye.
Josh, ciao. Okay.
In the beginning, right, we had a few more questions. When did it make sense to scale Scrum? Have we covered that sufficiently, you guys think?
I think
so.
Yeah, I think so as well. I think there was the one about the product owner role, right?
Yeah.
How does the role of the product owner change between teams with scaled Scrum?
Mm.
For me, it's kind of quite simple because for me, it doesn't.
Yeah. So yeah, it does. It doesn't, and it does at the same time, I would say. So my background is products. In a scaled environment, depending on what scale we're talking about. So if a product owner has one team working on the product and it becomes too much for the one team, and there's strong product demands justifying the creation of a second team, seed some of the people from the first team to help them start off. And then the ceremonies work a little bit differently. Essentially, you're working with two teams and they work off of a central backlog. Okay, so you work with two teams, but very similar. I think it gets more interesting when the organization has more than one product and there is some relationship between the products and therefore there's value for the product owners to collaborate. Right, so we're looking at portfolio level in a scaled environment. Things are a little bit different, I would say, right? Because there might be some dependencies between the products or synergies. So you might want to align your roadmaps in some sort of way. Some stakeholders might be the same, and therefore it might make sense to work together with another product owner in order to include those stakeholders. Some of those considerations come to mind. Jason, what about you?
For me, it's decision-making boundaries change the most with product ownership at scale. So using like delegation poker or delegation board, for example, to figure out where is the boundary of the decisions I can make. I've seen some teams where they do internal and external product owners, what they call it, where the internal one is really like a senior BA, for example, on the team. And the external product owner is the link to the customer. So if they've scaled beyond one team, I've seen some try that model too, but more or less it's just having a conversation around who decides what.
Yeah, and I must say that the delegation poker, all the delegation boards are really a good tool for this. The thing we noticed while scaling Scrum was that like the load for the product owner was increasing. Yeah, that's normal. So we delegated it. So actually, the teams were more talking to the customer. Product owner had the overall picture, but the details were discussed between the teams and the customers themselves because it made a lot of sense. And the delegation boards helped with that a lot. And actually, it also increase the empowerment of the teams because they were in the direct contact with the customer. They knew the product better. They knew what it is for and how it helps the customers. So actually, it helped everybody in the end.
Yeah, delegation poker is a really nice tool. Yeah.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? Let's have a look. Or we can just chat about something else.
The third one was, what are some challenges that arise when scaling Scrum? I think we talked about quite a few of those.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
For me, one recent challenge was that we had a silo-based teams. We had front-end developers, back-end developers, and from that we jumped straight into multi-team Scrum. And this was hard because not only we need to reshuffle all the teams and there were interpersonal boundaries and things like that, the people weren't accustomed to working in cross-functional teams. So that was a challenge for me. And retrospectively, probably next time, if I was doing it, I would try doing one team first, just to let them see how it works, and then do the rest, probably. This was sort of a big bang, and it didn't work quite well.
Yeah. I think I'm also a proponent of more organic change and organic transformation. But it reminds me of, in large-scale Scrum, there is this thing called the flip, right? Where the organization has been supported in meeting all the preconditions for moving from traditional IT project management all of a sudden to less. And the traditional way that the organization is structured ends at the end of Friday. Monday morning, everyone comes in, gets reminded of this is what you have been trained in less. This is the organizational design that we now need to achieve. This is the template of how many teams we need and what needs the role that needs to be in each of those teams. Go away, come back in 3 hours and let us know which names are in which teams.
Yeah.
Good. So that is a big bang approach. I've never witnessed one. I've read case studies, but I don't know.
Yeah, I witnessed that, but I think our problem was that, and I also, after we made it, because I am an idiot, yeah. So that I asked only after that. I asked the buzzword what he thinks, and we had like 9 teams, and he said, "Well, 9 is too many to make a big bang." He was like, "If you have fewer teams, like 5, 6, something like that, yeah, you can make a big bang. But if you are doing really a big transformation, probably a better approach is to do it step by step."
Mm. Yeah, there is a bank in the Netherlands, ING. Yes, they've been doing it in chunks. So I don't recall the specific numbers, but something around 50, maybe 70 people at a time. And each stage was done with a good support structure in place, though. Right, so there was training and coaching in order to help make that transformation work. So did you have any sort of coaching across the teams to help everyone get used to this cross-functional multi-team working?
Well, it was a big bang, so very limited, I would say. And that was another problem, right? Because the people weren't prepared for that. Basically, they have been doing it in those silos for, I don't know, 10 years before that. And then overnight, it changed. Everything changed, basically. And the training was really limited. So, yeah, that's another point. Perhaps if there was a better training or better preparation, better explanation or something like that, it definitely would have been much better.
Yeah, training before and coaching after.
Yeah. Okay. Do we have anything else? Because I don't think so. Or do we have anything else we want to discuss? Any other topics?
We have some people watching. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We can pick them up so that we ensure we cover anything that is still going through your mind before we close.
Okay. In the meantime, and I know it's very hard to do that, to say that. If you had really one thing that you think that anybody attempting to scale Scrum should really focus on, what would that be? Hi.
I guess the easy answer is people, but it's the people who are affected by that decision have to have a conversation. If that's 20 people or if that's 400 people, you as the change agent need to figure out how to help people understand the different perspective from people at all layers in the organization. And that might take a month, that might take 3 months. But I think, change readiness assessments used to be all the rage in Agile 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And then the shininess of that wore off and people moved on to something else. But that's been a good practice in the change world for decades. So, there's a consequence of not doing it and there's a consequence of doing it. And you have to have the conversations with the people who own that system of work and make them aware of the pros and cons for each of those types of approaches.
Yeah, fully agree. With the people, for the people.
Yep.
Yeah. The only thing that maybe as a fun point to do is to answer that question. If we were to ask Craig and Baz, that's the way that they start every training, every lecture or talk on this specific topic is if you intending to scale or go to large-scale product development, our response is don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you do, I have apart from the people, I have another one, which would be support from the organization. Because I've tried it once, if you don't have the support, like from the people actually paying for that, or from the responsible people, you are never going to succeed. And you need to have that real support, not just written support. Oh yeah, I'll support you. That's for nothing. They really need to support you and back the decisions that you make. Okay?
Yeah. And we're circling back to the first value on the Agile Manifesto.
Yes. Which is kind of a nice ending, right?
A wonderful ending.
Anyway, it was great chatting to you.
Same here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great to
See
you guys.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.